All right. Well, thank you, Kurt. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. As Kurt mentioned, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Paulson, and we specialize in understanding rural American audiences and how they impact key industries like agriculture, equipment, and energy. But for this study, we also worked with a company called Audit, and they're an independent research firm that really specializes in attitudinal segmentation and insights. Now, attitudinal research is more than just studying who is moving to rural America. Attitudinal research, in this case, identifies why they're moving. And I think that's pretty important as we look to see why people are moving to the country. So the Rural American Migration Study tries to address some really fundamental questions like what's going on? Why are people moving to rural America? And what are their attitudes about moving to the country? And this is really one of the first questions that we decided to address when we took a look at this study, because our clients were asking the same question too. And the reason they were asking the same questions is we were seeing a lot of this in the news. You can just pick up the newspaper, look online, and you're seeing studies and articles about this just about every day. Here's a recent one from the Wall Street Journal talking about emerging housing markets. And here's what they had to say. After more than a year working from home during the pandemic, many Americans are rethinking whether they want to return to commuting or even live near the office at all. Smaller and more rural housing markets are emerging as the hottest new places to live and own. And look at some of the markets that are seeing the greatest growth. Their smaller mid-sized markets are all around the country. The number one hottest market that people are moving to, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then Billings, Montana, Rapid City, South Dakota, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Raleigh, North Carolina. Again, small to mid-sized markets are seeing the greatest growth, and we wanted to understand why. Here's another recent article from The Hill. Rural America booms as young workers leave the cities behind. We've been seeing these types of headlines quite a bit. When the history of coronavirus is written, one of the most dramatic narratives will be about the decline of major cities and the simultaneous revitalization of more sparsely populated areas. The recent urban exodus has resulted in an accumulation of human and financial capital flush with talent and dollars for rural America. The trend could spark a renaissance in parts of the country that had previously been on the decline. Now, we discovered an attitude that confirms this assumption in our research. There is an untapped entrepreneurial spirit associated with living in rural America. Here's another headline: How a remote work boom and city exodus might reshape rural America. For the first time in decades, millions of Americans are reconsidering the benefits of urban living and setting their sights on suburbs, small towns, and rural areas. In a recent survey, 66% of people said they would consider moving away from the city if work from home became a permanent option at their company. This is one of the questions that we asked in our research as well. And again, we found that this attitude is confirmed by a lot of the things that you're seeing in the news. The idea of where we work and where we live are now decoupled. Remote work has 2/3 of Americans considering moving from the cities to the country. 2 out of 3 Americans would consider moving from cities to rural areas if work from home policies made mandatory due to the COVID-19 pandemic became standard. While a majority of Americans would prefer lower costs of living and larger living spaces, 67% of those surveyed reported that internet availability in an area would affect their decision to move to rural areas. So as much as they would love to move to the country, the one key factor is what's the internet service going to be like there? So our research confirms this too. The importance of infrastructure and conveniences, especially reliable internet service, make a huge difference in whether people are going to make that move or not. So obviously there's something going on here, and it's certainly worth studying. And what we wanted to do is conduct an attitudinal segmentation study, because when you look at the news and you listen to your clients, I think the key question is not just who or where they're moving to, but why. We want to understand what's going on. And we think it could be COVID. We think it could be the economy. We think it could be a lot of different factors. But what we wanted to find out is what's going on in the head. What are they feeling about this? So what we did is we surveyed 326 people from around the country, but they had to meet 2 very important criteria. To be able to participate in the study, they had to currently live in an urban area and are interested in moving to a rural area, or have already moved to rural areas in the United States. So we were very selective in who was able to participate in the survey. And it had to happen in 2020 or 2021, so it had to be fairly recent too. And this is how the respondents broke down. 2/3 of our respondents are city dwellers who are thinking about a rural move. 1/3 of the respondents are rural residents already who have moved from an urban environment in 2020, 2021. So we're getting some really good perspectives of those who already live in rural America and have made a recent move. And we're getting some really good perspectives of people who are thinking about moving. Now, our methodology is we used an online survey panel of qualified respondents. The analysis was designed to reveal audience segments based on the attitudes that they share with each other. Segments were not predetermined. Everybody had to self-select. We looked at 41 different attitudes and asked participants to agree or disagree with several key statements. And then, based on those agreements, we analyzed the responses to see how they were connected. What connected these people? And what we discovered were interesting. We have 3 different attitudinal segments. And we call them ruralists, urbanists, and space seekers. And I'm going to define what this really means because it's important to understand that where they come from isn't necessarily how they feel about themselves. Ruralists, or 26% of the respondents, see themselves as living a rural lifestyle. 41% of the participants see themselves as being urbanists, but still want to live in the country. And 33% of the respondents really don't identify with being a ruralist or an urbanist. They really see themselves as something more unique, but they're identified by the shared attributes of being space seekers. And we're going to go into each one of these segments a little bit. What defines them, what motivates them, and what makes them unique from each other. But I think it's important to understand that these segments are defined by how the participants see themselves, not necessarily where they live right now. So let's take a closer look at what makes each one of these segments. These are the attitudes that ruralists agreed with most. First of all, you have to understand that ruralists are really enamored with rural living. So even if they live in the city right now and they're thinking about moving to the country, they consider themselves ruralists by many, many different factors. They believe rural areas are more beautiful than cities. They're more likely to agree that a rural lifestyle is healthier, that there are more opportunities to have greater impact on their community. Living in a city is more challenging. They believe rural communities offer comparable opportunities for entrepreneurs. They believe that rural lifestyle is more friendly, more honest, more self-reliant, more innovative, and more environmentally conscious than city dwellers. And they're more invested in the communities and more likely to work together to solve problems. So this is what ruralists believe. Now that's different from an urbanist. Urbanists are firmly city lovers. Now urbanists can still be living in the country. They can still want to live in the country, but they still have this affinity for what they enjoy about living in the city. They love the hustle and bustle of big cities. They believe that the best opportunities for self-sufficiency really does exist in cities. They need to live near excellent schools and a major airport. They feel rural residents are less connected to the rest of the world. They believe and think rural residents want to go back to a previous way of life instead of embracing the future. And they overwhelmingly feel that the lives of rural Americans are more like living in 1950 than living in today's world. These are the attributes that they agree with most. Then you've got that third segment, the space seekers. And what's interesting about space seekers is they're really only defined by 3 or 4 key attitudes. They don't see themselves as being ruralists, and they don't see themselves necessarily as being urbanists. They're really unique unto themselves, but they only want 3 things. They want more indoor space, they want more outdoor space, and more peace and quiet where they live. What's interesting about this segment is they're least likely to want to live in a rural area, but also disagree with the attitudes that define the urbanists. They're least likely of all the groups to be happy where they currently live. We call them the malcontents, the discontents. They're not happy, and they're looking for happiness in living in rural America. Motivation isn't about where they're going, it's about how much space they'll have once they get there. So they dream of having that extra space. And it's also important to remember that these segments come from all areas. Like I said, a ruralist can be living in the city right now, but see themselves as living in the country. Conversely, an urbanist can be living in the country, but still appreciate the conveniences of city life. Now, for instance, if you look at the urbanist sector alone in orange here, where they live now versus where they where they live now, they're living in small towns. They're living in small towns near large city urban centers, small towns in rural areas, or in rural locations some distance from the city or town. That's over 40% of our respondents who live in rural America still see themselves and identify with being an urbanist. When you look at distribution by move status, it gets kind of interesting. We kind of looked at among those who have recently moved from an urban to rural location versus among those planning to move to a rural location. What we think really interesting here is only 15% are identified as true ruralists. Most of the people planning to move in the future, they're urbanists and they're space seekers. So what's the big idea here? What's the light bulb, as we call it? Most of those planning to move aren't enamored with living in rural America. Many would prefer living in a city, but have moved or are considering a move to a rural area to address other challenges or to achieve other goals. Fully 1/3 really didn't prefer either option as long as they could find more space and a sense of tranquility they currently lack. So I think that was one of the bigger observations that we saw in looking at these three segments. But if we dive in a little bit deeper, let's take a look at city dwellers considering a rural move. Why did they move? What were their reasons for moving? 71% of them said they want more land or space around their home. 67% said having fewer people around. 62% getting more home for less money. Living in a safer environment, 58%, and want clean air and water, 51%. These were the 5 or 6 biggest drivers of why city dwellers were considering a rural move. But there were some other factors as well. Lower cost of living, avoiding traffic, and living in an area with a different culture. They were identified by sizable groups as a reason for moving. For example, being around people that were more like me, 29% of the respondents indicated that was a reason. Living in a state with a different political leadership, 29% of the respondents indicated that as a reason. If we dive in a little bit deeper to urbanists, here's some interesting things that we've discovered about urbanists. They are more likely to say that an entrepreneurial vision or business idea is really a motivator and that they want to be part of an economic growth in rural America. So here's an urbanist who wants to live in the country and they really see the economic opportunities of doing so. That was a huge margin. 53% of urbanists saw entrepreneurial and business opportunities in rural America. And space seekers are far more likely to cite having more land and space around their home. I think 93% of space seekers want more land. 71% fewer people, 68% of space seekers, more home for their money. So by a vast majority, they just wanted to get away. So what are some of their expectations? So as you're thinking about moving to rural America, what do you expect that you're going to need to own? You know, in this particular survey question, we actually indicated that an acre was, a little more than a football field, about 1.3 times of a football field to give them some sort of scope or scale. And we asked them, how much land do you think you're going to need? Well, 56% said they'll expect to own 1 to 5 acres once they move. 32% said they expect a large backyard or property under an acre, and 12% plan to own more than 5 acres. We didn't see really a lot of difference between the different segments, but this is really their expectations of size of property that they hope to own. And some of the top concerns with those considering a rural move, going back to what we saw in the news articles, what you're seeing reported, is the availability of internet access is right at the top there. That is really critical to them being able to move away from the city and conduct their lives and grow their businesses. 37% indicated employment opportunities. 32% isolation was a key factor. And access to shopping and retail locations. If you look at these top concerns and you look at where those top markets are, there's a reason why Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Billings, Montana, and Rapid City are seeing such growth, is they're still able to offer internet access, employment opportunities, shopping, entertainment, education, etc. So being part of rural America means not being completely removed from the amenities that they enjoy about the city. When we ask the question, where are city dwellers planning to move? You can choose any that apply. Some decided, well, I would still consider living in the city. But look at the breakdown of where people are hoping or planning to move. Suburbs near a large city or urban center, 35%. They want to move out, but not too far away from the city. Small town near a large city or urban center. Medium-sized city or town, 65%. Again, I think that tracks with what we saw in those top markets across the United States, from Coeur d'Alene to Fort Wayne, Indiana, a medium-sized city or town. Small town in a rural area, 22%. Rural location, some distance from a city or town. Look at those last two, small town in a rural area or a rural location, some distance from a city or town. You're still looking at nearly 36% of the respondents said, I would like to move that far away into a rural setting. That's quite a bit. And where are they planning to move? This was just a quick question we wanted to ask. You can choose additional states if you wanted, but look at the top states. The top responses were Texas, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Colorado, California, my home state, South Dakota. We usually don't rank very high on surveys, and look at us here, South Dakota, Ohio, Montana, and the list goes down all the way to Alabama. But this is where the respondents said they're thinking about moving to. How far would you move? I think that's a really key question as you think about this rural migration. Within 20 miles of my current city, small percentage did. 21 to 60 miles from my current city, 15%. Up to 120 miles away from my current city, 18%. In a different part of my current state, low percentage, 3%. Nearby state, 11%. But look at this last one, to a state in a different part of the country, 45%. And again, that tracks with what we're seeing in the news as well. People are willing to travel long distances across the country to achieve their objective. That's how far they'd be willing to go. This is just a compilation of all the reasons people had for moving, top to bottom. They're ranked: more land and space, fewer people, more home for less money, safer environment, living in a part of the country with cleaner air and water, lower cost of living, being part of a smaller community. You can just kind of look at the factors of what's driving people's consideration for moving. We think this is important as we're trying to develop content or marketing messages. If we can tap into why they're moving, we can develop marketing messages that are aligned with their reasoning. Would they change jobs to move? And think about what you're seeing in the media right now. It's hard to find workers. There's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of growth, but boy, there's a workforce misalignment, if you will, what's happening in this country. We can't get enough workers to the right areas. But would they change jobs to move? 68% said definitely. I think that's a huge factor. I think you're seeing a huge transition right now of where people live and where they work. Like we said earlier, it's really being decoupled. They don't have to be in the same area anymore. So the light bulb, or the big idea here, is the distance and having to change jobs is not a barrier for most urban residents considering a rural move. They're really open to big change, to big moves across the country. So we have to ask the question, what is the impact of COVID-19? So when we ask the question from employers, how will your employer expect you to work in 2021? The respondents said, 32% said they expected all employees to be in the office. 41% of them said employers are blending remote and in-office work, so a little flexibility in both. And 100%, 25% are going 100% remote. So there's a lot of transition here from being in the office to a blend to completely out of office. And I don't think America's ever seen that before. And I don't think it's really going to change that much in the future. We're always going to be dealing with some flexibility here. So if you look at COVID-19 impact, 67% of the respondents say their organization changed policies about where employees can work due to COVID-19. That's a huge factor. 52% of those planning a rural move say that these policies made them more interested in moving to a rural area. That's over half the respondents said they were planning a rural move because of these COVID-19 policies. So the light bulb here is the employer policies around work location related to COVID-19 clearly has had an influence on those considering moving to a rural location. It sort of upset the apple cart, if you will, and now people are opening up to possibilities, to opportunities, and to big what ifs in their lives. So now we wanted to ask the questions knowing that we were going to have this presentation. I should also mention that this is the first time we presented this. This is literally just off the data analyst about a week ago. And so you're the first to see this presentation, but we wanted to make sure that we added some questions about equipment. So out of the respondents, we asked, for those planning to move, what do you expect you'll need? What kind of equipment do you think you'll need? 53% said they expect to need a riding mower. 21% expected to purchase a tractor, and 21% also said they need livestock handling equipment. And 52% expect to need fencing. So before they even moved, they had an idea in their head of what they needed. Now, for those actually living in a rural area now, what do they own? 37% have a riding lawnmower, 28% have fencing, 29% have a storage building, and 22% have a tractor. Now, you're noticing that numbers are a little bit different in some regards, and we think if we look back at the research, the data says there's a little bit of a misalignment between what I expect I'll need and what I'll actually need once I get the land. But there was also a nice little correlation between how much land I think I'll need. So they have this dream or this idea that they're going to have 5 acres, and when they actually decide to purchase that land, it's a lot more expensive than they thought, or it's not as accessible as they thought. So they're not purchasing as much land as they expected, which influences their equipment and their purchase decisions. So that's why there's a little bit of a misalignment. So the light bulb here is there's a gap between what people expect to purchase in terms of property size and the equipment needed to maintain that property. People thinking about moving to the country need advice and information about choosing the right equipment for their property. Size, feature, comparisons, where the local dealers are at. So before they even make that move, and once they make the move, what a great opportunity to sort of build brand preference. There's an opportunity to help future rural dwellers realize their goals about more space, self-reliance, safety, and even working from home. So some of our key insights are this. The rural migration is more than just city dwellers moving away from the country because of COVID. Americans are moving towards something. COVID just kind of helped propel that forward. They're looking for safety, security, fulfillment, connectedness with each other. And COVID-19 and technology have accelerated the shift in how Americans are able to prioritize their time, relationships, and careers. They're really rethinking everything in that regard. Rural communities that offer reliable internet access with access to urban conveniences, healthcare, airport, shopping, education, entertainment really have the greatest growth potential. That's why you're seeing those mid-sized markets really experiencing the best growth. Suburbs near a large city or urban center are doing well. Small towns near large cities and urban centers are doing well. And those medium-sized cities like Billings, Coeur d'Alene, Fort Wayne, Rapid City will continue to see that growth. And brands that understand why Americans are moving to rural areas are able to help people make the move and establish brand product of preference before they ever get there. So those are some of the key insights from what we learned about these 3 important audience segments. At this time, and of course, if you want more information, you can download an executive summary of the research, much of which we discussed here, but also additional breakouts, some rankings, and some more insights that you'll find on our website. So I know that was a pretty quick fly through with a lot of information, but at this time, I'd be glad to take any questions.
That's fantastic, Mark. Thank you for, I love being the guinea pig and seeing information for the first time. And I don't know about everyone on the call here, but I was kind of blown away by some of the insights here that are certainly unique. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the chat. We'd love to have those. We've got Mark online here for another 15 minutes or so to be able to answer questions, and certainly we'll make sure that you have the ability to get access to the executive summary, as he mentioned in there. We'll put that in the chat. Keith Johnson has a question. Keith's question is the drive up in housing prices due to this migration or hedge fund purchasing of home sites or both? Interesting question, Keith.
Okay. Now, first of all, we did not ask or study that question specifically, but if you look at some of the responses of why people are moving because they wanted to get more home for the money, I think you could do a secondary study and track how many people are selling their homes in large cities and getting a lot more bang for their buck in rural communities.
Sounds good. Thank you for that. And I think there's obviously, having studied this lifestyle market for a very long time, there's some of this information, this new migration is very counter to what we've heard before. So I think that's, normally we wouldn't have had a question like that. So it's very interesting. Matthias Peters has a question. What was the age breakout of respondents, and do you see any difference between the age demos?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I should have addressed that earlier, as a matter of fact. So the one thing about attitudinal segmentation studies, normally we don't see a huge difference in age or income. That's really defined by how people think and feel. But in this particular case, what we saw with the ruralists is they are over 50 years old. Primarily, most of them are going to be over 50. The urbanists are going to be under 40. And other than that, they kind of broke out the same for income and some other demographic breakouts, but the age differences between ruralists and urbanists were pretty well defined.
That's interesting. And I guess it shouldn't come as a big surprise of the age demo between those two particular groups. Let's talk about those demo groups just a little bit. You had a comment that I found, I don't know, shocking. I don't know, maybe it's too strong of a word, but certainly interesting. You said that the ruralists see themselves as being more sustainable and tied to the land and the balances of the groups. I'd be interested in you expanding on that just a little bit, because I found that to be sort of a really interesting comment and maybe counter to popular opinion or even what you hear in the press today.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because when our group took a look at the data, I think that is what a lot of our team members were looking at as well. When you think about a quote unquote city dweller urbanist, they seem to be sort of more aware of where their food comes from, and they're buying whole foods and organic, and they believe in renewable energy and things like that, correct? But if you look at what a ruralist really values and how they see themselves in the land, they're looking at different aspects of sustainability. We've conducted other research with rural lifestylers, not this study per se, but one that we did last year and the year before. And we asked, why do they want to live in rural America? What drives them? And they're thinking things like keeping bees and growing gardens and being more, I think, connected to the land in a more realistic way than some others within the city have envisioned. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And again, I think those of us that serve the rural market and ag markets get that. But I think that's a story that, frankly, Mark and Sarah, I want to have a conversation with you guys a little bit more, because that might actually help some of our advocacy efforts when we're talking about environmental sustainability, because I think there are some clear attitudinal changes that, need to be fought just a little bit there. So
Kurt,
put that one on the bulletin board.
Kurt, just to kind of tie into that a little bit, we would say that ruralists have a more practical application of sustainability, and urbanists have a more aspirational application of sustainability.
That's a fair way to say that, Mark. A very fair way to say that. So I see we have another question from Keith. Actually, I thought it was Keith Johnson. It's actually Keith Jason. Sorry. Was there any indication of the projected reduction of available farmland with decreased urbanization from a macro perspective? That's a heady question there, Keith. But yeah. I think let's take a look at what does this mean for the available farmlands, and what's the impact there?
No, I think that's a good question. Again, that's one we did not address with this, but it's also something that we're staying really closely tied to. We work with extension offices that study this. As a matter of fact, our university just up the road, South Dakota State University, is actually doing a seminar on that very subject here this month. So this is a subject that is being addressed at the university level, at that economic macro level that you're asking about. So I think universities are aware of it as well.
I think there's a whole lot of work that's going to be done over the next 5 to 10 years about land use and ownership of land and how this all impacts everything else. Obviously, a very interesting time to be involved in agriculture, but also a very challenging time if you're in the market to buy some land somewhere, as you know. As I think about this whole conversation that you've had here, representing, ag equipment manufacturers specifically and equipment manufacturers in general. You had a couple of slides on there of what are their needs. We obviously, and I'm looking at some of the friendly faces on the screen here, knowing that they're all targeting this market specifically for potential future sales. I guess what sort of insight can you give us to this into this market of, if you're looking to market to an urbanist or a ruralist or someone that's moving there for the first time, how do you convince them? Obviously a lawnmower, we love that, but boy, I bet Greg Petrus would like to sell them some forage equipment, and so would Dietz Langhorst would love to sell them some balers out there. I see both of them on the line here. So how do we take them even to the next level?
Well, I think what we learned from this survey and others that we've conducted is how important it is to help educate the marketplace. If customers don't know exactly what equipment they'll need or even what their applications will be, that's the role of the brand and the dealer in helping them make that decision. So we work with a lot of brands in helping move that transition from I'm thinking about equipment to actually purchasing. That's a really opportune time to educate that consumer, and that dealer is going to be a really important part of that. Secondarily, great content educating the marketplace is going to be a really key part of that. So instead of addressing the market saying, we have equipment and here's what it does, we really need to kind of look at equipment and say, what would you like to do with it? And then kind of help them make a better purchase decision based on that.
So you mentioned the dealer just a little bit there, and obviously we know the importance of distribution in this market. We also know the importance of that information at that dealer level. So as you're looking to some of the executives that are on the call here today, any advice that you could give them to communicate with their dealers to help them, be better equipped to service this market with that education mission that you're talking about?
I think that's where probably one of the better opportunities lie. We've seen this in the rural lifestyle space for well over a decade now. The ability to talk to a prospective customer that doesn't understand what a PTO is, and really kind of talk about the practical applications of the equipment and what allows them to achieve, not just what the equipment does, but what would that allow you to achieve. If you have a dream perhaps of doing something with the land, let's have discussions about what that actually looks like and what type of equipment you're going to need. It's also important to make sure that you're not focusing just on one gender. You really need to make sure that you've got both the husband and the wife involved in that decision making, because they're going to be involved with it just as much as the husband will. So understanding that dynamic is going to be very important to the dealer too. So whatever preconceived notions you might have about equipment owners, you really kind of have to break it down to, I'm going to educate the marketplace. I'm going to treat everybody as if I'm going to help them realize their dreams or objectives of living in rural America. And I'm going to listen first to what those objectives actually are.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. Let's go back to the research on that just a little bit. And you had a slide that again sort of blew my mind when looking at who is in transition to moving in rural areas and who is going to be moving to the rural areas very soon. And I think you pointed out how striking it was that the ruralists are kind of already there or already in process, but the ones that are coming are the urbanists.
Yep.
And I think two commentary first, but then maybe just to let you add a little bit more. As you talk about education, that urbanist is probably even less familiar than the current ruralist would be about what equipment does. So I think that's an interesting opportunity there. But I'd just like for you to comment a little bit more of your take on what is that going to mean for the demographic? What's that going to mean for rural America in general when those attitudinal changes happen in the rate that they could potentially happen?
There's a lot to look at in that particular question, Kurt. If you look at how will that change rural America, how will that affect equipment sales at that local level, I think there's a lot of things going on in that question there. So I'm going to break it down in the two parts. In terms of how that's going to change rural America, don't really know, but we definitely have some ideas that we think. If you look at why they're moving to the country, they're not moving so much to the most remote aspects of our country. They're still somewhat connected to those mid-sized markets where they get to enjoy some of those amenities of living in a city. Education is going to be important. Economic opportunities are going to be important. I like to go back to that slide where they see the economic opportunities of rural America. There's a real entrepreneurial spirit that they're going to bring to rural America that hopefully opens up new businesses, that creates better tax bases for our communities. And I think I say we because I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We see ourselves as part of and identify part of that market, but I think we have to be really open to helping them realize their entrepreneurial dreams of building something here. Because let's be honest, in the last 10 to 20 years, that really hasn't been the case. I think there's a lot of opportunities in these smaller markets too, if we can embrace and figure out how can we engage from a business standpoint. I think there's some incredible opportunities. And conversely, I think that will lead to more sales of small horsepower equipment. A lot of these people really aren't looking at more than 5 acres. Anything under that 5 acre, tier is why you're seeing that growth in small horsepower equipment, especially, and we'll also add side-by-sides. We'll also add implements along that as well. I wish somebody would have told me why I needed a drill seed planter and before I bought my first piece of equipment. Now I have to go buy new equipment. So all kinds of things like that.
Well, Mark, you are welcome to buy as much equipment as you can potentially afford. We are in favor of you buying more equipment. I encourage everyone that responds through the survey to do the same thing. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're here for.
If I could just be a quick anecdote, moving myself to the country, I underbought. Okay, so I really need to upgrade my equipment. So.
Well, you know what? I bet a lot of people on this call would be able to help you out with that immediately here. So I see a question here about, are we able to share the mean or median incomes on this? So any other additional financial income data about the study? Do you have anything on that, Mark?
Yeah, we have actually, I could have gone all day about that. All of this information is presented in Tableau, and I don't know if I can still share my screen or not, but we have all these breakdowns of the demographics behind it, including income, including age brackets, etc., that we can cross-tab and cross-dial all day long. So I don't know if I still have the opportunity to share. I could pull that up, or we can have a separate discussion later on that.
Why don't we offer this, Mark, just for the sake of, because we're getting close to the end of our time here. Let's continue on with the conversation, and then what I would open up is that anyone that is interested in speaking with you directly, I would ask that perhaps you or Sarah put your names in your emails in the chat, and those folks can reach out to you directly, and that would be a chance for you to learn a little bit more if they want to, pull on one of those strings a little bit more. That might be good.
Yep, we'll do that right now.
So you think about this. I love that you drew the connection of the entrepreneurial spirit and the economic benefit of rural America, which is very different than, again, the story we've heard for the last 20 years about rural areas. It seems like there's a lot of focus there, but also, again, thinking about what does that mean for our industry as ag equipment companies or folks that are living in rural areas in general. Is like, if you bring in entrepreneurial spirits to some of these areas that haven't had economic development for the last 30 years. Seems to be a very exciting time. It seems to be very, exciting opportunities, not just to kind of serve that same market that we've always served, but really new people with new finances coming into those rural areas. Provides a tremendous amount of opportunities, but is very different than what we've been servicing them today. That wasn't a question here. It was more just, hey, react to that.
So when we're working with clients and we see research like this, we start looking at where the opportunities might lie. And yes, it lies in selling equipment, but what are the ancillary opportunities within that? That means, how am I going to work with local contractors to build something? How am I going to develop a workforce that is going to be available to us? How am I going to work with education to make sure that that's a trained workforce? So not just selling equipment, it's how it's connected to the community and where are those opportunities to build out from there. So we're seeing in a lot of communities, it's not just about selling something, it's about building something. Does that make sense?
It
does. So equipment is really at the foundational get it done philosophy. That I think if you can kind of tap into all those other sectors, education, economic growth, contractors, workforce development, etc., equipment is right there to get it done. and you need to kind of think about how they're all connected within a rural community.
I think that's very, very key, is that it's not just one thing. And I think it's really, really good insight for us to understand why people moved there, and then take advantage of those. I've got, I don't see any additional questions. We are getting close on time, but I did want to ask one more question that I had, which was really kind of where are the city dwellers planning to move question that you had put forward. I found some fascinating numbers there, because that also seems a little different than some of the numbers that some of the states that we've seen in the past when folks look at moving to rural areas. Texas has always been a strong area for rural growth. And we kind of consider that whole Southern smile as particularly strong. But boy, there's some new ones in there. Colorado, Colorado's been growing, pretty sharply, but Ohio and Arizona, Utah, Montana. I guess I'd like to hear your reaction. Were you surprised at some of those states that were considered in the where would you move to response?
If there was just one reason why people moved, and they were moving to places like Coeur d'Alene or Rapid City or Fort Wayne, I think it would make that very easy to define. But what we determined was there were 20 different reasons why somebody would consider moving, and there's a whole there's a lot to consider in each one for each individual. But some of the key things that we saw that those smaller mid-sized markets met a lot of criteria is I can still get great internet access. I'm still have access to entertainment, culture, maybe not on the level of a big city, but those smaller mid-sized markets do a pretty good job of meeting those criteria. So I can still live in the country, so to speak, or live in a rural city, but still not be so removed from what I enjoy about. That's what urbanists still want to feel connected to those. Our secondary research is going to be how many of these markets are actually tied to universities, how many are tied to areas of economic growth or development that you really wouldn't be aware of. There's a lot of small markets with great manufacturing that are just sort of like well-kept secrets in America.
Boy, I'll tell you, that line, Mark, is a perfect line for us to end this conversation on. There are many great areas in rural areas that are strong on manufacturing, and some of these people are actually on the call here today. So, good way to sort of wrap it up. This was a fascinating conversation, Mark. Thank you for the time, and thanks everyone for listening in. Again, I encourage you to stay on for just a few more minutes, because we're going to get you a survey, but then also know that the executive summary is listed here for you to be able to download as you see fit. And we also put Mark and Sarah's emails in there for you to have additional questions. So again, thanks everyone for those that participated. Please visit the events page on our website for a full lineup of additional webinars that we're going to have in this series. Right now, we're putting up a 2 brief session evaluation questions in this chat. And if your chat box is not already up, please open it up now. Take a few minutes to fill out these surveys, and they'll be very helpful for us to continue to guide the future conversation. Again, I want to thank Mark for the time today to present, and our friends from Paulson for being generous with sharing this information first to the public. Appreciate that. And then also, absolutely, thank you to our sponsors, Optimum Info and Succulent. This completes today's program, and we wish you a safe and pleasant day. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.